May it please the court. Opposing counsel, members of the jury. Earlier today, my co-counsel, Jessa Miller, she stood right where I'm standing, she looked at you, and she reminded you that when you're driving, you have to pay attention. In fact, by law, you are required to drive in such a way that it is necessary to avoid a collision. But when it's dark, and it's damp, and it's dangerous because of cars and people on the road, you have to pay particularly close attention. Throughout this trial, you heard about how the defendant, Jody Jacobson, was not paying attention on the evening of May 14th, 2012. You heard about how Chris Reagan, plaintiff, got out of work. It's pretty late. He walked across First Street, got in his car, wanted to put his key in the ignition, but dropped it. Well, tried to search around, tried to find them. Couldn't find them. Went to turn his light on, wasn't working. So he looked out. He looked out his window to make sure no cars were coming. And he didn't see any headlights and no cars coming. It was a dark street. Remember that. Well, not seeing anything heading his way, he opened the door, figured he'd get a little bit of light in. Once he opened that door, he heard the squealing of tires. Just then he looked up, and he saw a black Audi. The defendant's black Audi, without its headlights on. And he did what he could, tried to close the door, but it wasn't fast enough. Just then, Miss Jacobson smashed into his car door so hard that not even the paramedics could get him out of that door. He had to be pulled through the passenger side. Then she still didn't stop. In fact, she testified that she still didn't stop. She didn't stop until a pole was in her way and stopped the car for her. It was dark, damp, and dangerous on May 14th. Members of the jury, reasonable people gauge the circumstances around them. They take into account the conditions, they look around, figure out what's going on, and they act accordingly. That's how a person uses reasonable care. We ask you to remember that the failure to use reasonable care, that's negligence. When a person's negligent, and that negligence leads to an injury, a person should be held responsible. Now, in just a few moments, Judge Hoffman will give you your jury instructions. On those jury instructions, you'll receive several statutes, ones that we have referenced throughout our case. But along with those instructions, you will receive a jury form, or a jury verdict form. It's going to look just like this, except a little bit smaller. First question: was the defendant, Jody Jacobson, negligent? That's when we want you to remember that it was dark, it was damp, and it was dangerous. Let's first talk about how it was dark. All four witnesses that you heard that they told you it was dark on First Street, that it was usually dark. But it was particularly dark this night because it had been raining. So Ms. Jacobson, at 10 o'clock at night, on a dark street, had an obligation. She was required by law to make sure her headlights were on. Now you heard her say that she's almost positive that her headlights were on. You heard Kelly Holm say that he thinks that the headlights were on. Now you heard Chris Reagan say that he knows that those headlights were on. Otherwise, why would he have opened the door? But the definitive proof is that those headlights were in fact off once she was in that hole. In fact, I wrote down what she said because I wanted to make sure that I read it back to you verbatim. She said, "They must have been off because when I got out of the car, the lights were off." Now, members of the jury, you're allowed to use your common sense today. And we ask you to remember that Miss Jacobson had just gotten in a crash. Pat Miller was able to get to the car almost immediately after it hit the pole. And once she got there, the lights were off. You also heard straight out of the defendant's mouth, "I was in excruciating pain." And in fact, she said the word excruciating pain multiple times. Within seconds, in that much pain, with an airbag deployed, in shock, it's the first thing that a person would think of, "Oh, I need to turn off my headlights." Members of the jury, our standard is more likely than not. We have to prove to you that it was more likely than not that Miss Jacobson was negligent. But was it more likely than not that she turned off her lights within seconds of being in that much pain, excruciating pain? We don't believe this. Now, we also ask you to remember that it was Zenith that evening. Because of that, Miss Jacobson had a duty to drive at a reasonable speed. Now, no one has testified that they know for sure how fast Miss Jacobson was driving. Nobody was clocking her. Nobody has given you an exact number. Their two witnesses think she was driving about 15 miles per hour. But 15 miles per hour on a street with only 11 feet in between Mr. Reagan's car and the truck on the other side, on a narrow street where only one car can go through at a time, on a street that was wet and slick, 15 miles per hour starts to sound a little unreasonable. It starts to sound like it's just still not slow enough. In fact, she was required by law to drive at a speed that is necessary to avoid hitting any car or person. 15 miles per hour did not stop her from hitting Chris Reagan's parked car. Third, we ask you to remember that it was dangerous on First Street. There were plenty of cars parked on the street. Students were getting out of class. In fact, Miss Jacobson herself had just gotten out of class. She knew students were walking around. Kelly Holm told you that he has seen students dart from out between the cars. He himself has darted from out between cars. A person has to be on alert. If Chris Reagan had been parked in the middle of the street, Mr. Jacobson couldn't have hit his car. She wouldn't have had the ability to hit his car. If a child had run out from in between the cars, Miss Jacobson couldn't just hit the child. It was dangerous. And because she was driving without her headlights, she was driving at an unreasonable speed and she wasn't paying attention, we ask you to make sure that you answer yes to the first question. Then you will be given the second question. Was her negligence a direct cause of this crash? That's when we ask you to remember that Mr. Reagan looked out his window specifically to see if any cars were coming, to see if there were any headlights coming. And he didn't see any, so he opened his door. It's also when we ask you to remember that she was driving, not paying attention, and did her actions, the fact that she hit a parked car, did that cause this crash? That's when we ask you, yes, of course. Answer yes, of course. Because had she not been driving in such a way, this crash never would have happened. The third question, because the defendants are arguing comparative negligence, was Chris Reagan negligent? Now, we have agreed. Chris Reagan was parked a foot farther out from the car. But that's when we ask you to remember this picture that you saw today. This is his whole car door. It's 4 feet. His car door was hit 3.5 feet in. 3.5 feet in. Had he been parked that extra foot in, his car still would have been hit 2.5 feet in. That's why the answer to number 4 would be no. And that question is, was his negligence a direct cause of the crash? Had he been parked where the defendants claim he should have been, the crash still would have occurred. Once you finally finish those 4 questions, you'll be asked to assign a percentage of fault. That's when the power is all yours. And you get to decide. You get to decide who has to take responsibility. Whose choices that night actually caused this crash. You can answer that Chris Reagan has no responsibility, that this crash would have happened no matter where he was parked. You could put 0% if you want to. And you can assign the blame. You can put the responsibility on Ms. Jacobson. Members of the jury, as I mentioned, our burden is to prove to you that it was more likely than not. It was more likely than not that Jody Jacobson was driving in a negligent manner. And that negligence is what caused this crash. That negligence is what caused Chris Reagan to be injured. Now, Ms. Jacobson told you she was almost positive that her lights were on. That she was pretty sure she was driving about 15 miles per hour. Why wasn't she sure? Why is she not completely certain? Why can she not look you in the eyes and tell you, you know what? I knew it was dark. I knew it was dangerous, so I made sure to be driving the way I should have been. It's because she wasn't paying attention. It's when people don't pay attention that accidents occur. It's when people don't pay attention that they hit parked cars on the street. To be reasonable, to use reasonable care, a person has to look at the conditions around them and act accordingly. For drivers, you have to pay attention. We ask you to consider all the evidence today. We ask you to weigh the credibility. We thank you for being able to understand the evidence that we've given you and be able to weigh it all when you're determining that Jody Jacobson was liable, completely liable, and responsible for this crime.